Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist actually, but in the early 90s, I think, he and his colleague Abraham Tversky, who's since died, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, and basically for some psychological research on people's economic behaviour, which Kahneman had done. He wrote up a popular version of it called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is still in the Sunday Times paperback bestseller lists, and unknown for a book of that kind. Last week it had just topped sales of 288,000, which is pretty amazing. But one of the reasons it's so it's deservedly popular is because of the things that he gets at, which haven't been commented on elsewhere. One of the things that he talks about is the way in which, faced with a difficult question, we generally answer a slightly easier question, a simplified version of it, and sometimes don't realise what difference that makes and the steps which we've taken to get to there. And that's it's certainly an issue which arises in relation to assessment in an educational context. Sometimes you want to assess whether somebody can do an extremely complex task, but unfortunately actually performing that complex task in the real world just takes too long, or it requires too much equipment, or overseeing it for assessment purposes would require too much manpower and staff time, not to be sexist. And so instead you set up some kind of simplified simulation. And it looks right, except that what you're assessing is something which is in a simplified simulation, and it steps just a little bit away from the original. Generally speaking, we make the assumption that if there are two components, although they're much more intimately linked than this would suggest, within the teaching process, that there is the content of what you're teaching, and then there's the assessment of what the students have learned. And we tend to think about that as being a one-way process. Of course, what we're aware of is that, no, the assessment reaches back into the content. So that if, for example, you've got a large class and you don't really know how to process the results of what you're teaching them, the easiest way to do it is to use multiple choice questions, so-called objective testing, which you sort of tick the appropriate box. It's easy to process, it can even be done by optical character recognition, stick it through the computer, and so on. But of course what that does is that in order to prepare people to do that kind of assessment, then it in turn reaches back into the class, so that you start teaching people lots of like gobbets of discrete bits of information here, there, everywhere, so that they can memorise them, and when they're presented with a multiple choice question about them, they will recognise the right answer and they will tick it. Now that is a different way of approaching the information than, for example, like telling the story of what happened. I just think what happens, there's a debate going on at the moment between Michael Gove and Tristram Hunt and various other people about the teaching of history, and particularly about the First World War and the origins of the First World War. And you picked up on this. You're aware that the debate is going on. One way in which you can teach it is through telling the story of what happened. And you can concentrate on telling the story and trying to make it bring it alive and get people to realise what actually was the impact of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and things like that. Or you can look at it from a quirky angle, and you can say A.J.P. Taylor started his classic lecture on the origins of the First World War by saying, the First World War came about because of railway timetables. And he then proceeded to expand on this thesis very convincingly. He said basically the logistics of the First World War would have been impossible without the railway infrastructure to be able to take material to the front. So it all came down to that. Necessary and sufficient factors for the creation of the conflict, or for the actual enactment of the conflict. So it's a fascinating story. But by the time you said there will be a test on this next period, then all of the nuances, all of the interesting bits, all the connections and so on just disappear. And you start mugging up, well, where was the Archduke Ferdinand assassinated? Or on what date? And so on and so forth. So it changes one's focus into mugging up for an exam. So the challenge is, of course, how do you create an assessment which will enable you to get into the fascinating stories and the underlying principles and so on. In fact,
sometimes it can break down a fluid movement that shouldn't be broken down into stages. Suddenly it doesn't become logical anymore. So if you're talking about the movement of the body, for example, you're trying to break it down to its phases and the muscle groups that create that movement, then suddenly it doesn't seem to relate to reality or a natural movement pattern anymore. So to me, that I prefer to see things in reality as it moves and an animation maybe, rather than seeing exactly what individual processes are happening. But it's a necessary form to pass an exam at the time.
Yeah. Some very interesting points along those lines, which are made by Lord Gregory Bateson, and he suggests that an important distinction in skill learning is just how it can be broken down, or whether it's a fluid whole in which basically you can't stop. You've got to follow it through. So watching Splash on TV, then obviously a dive is not something which you can stop halfway through and say go back and correct. He makes the distinction, actually, following on from a guy called Littlestead, about the distinction between firing a rifle and firing a shotgun. And his argument is that you can atomise the process of firing a rifle, or aiming it and firing it, because until the moment when you pull the trigger, there is an opportunity to correct. But firing a shotgun, fluid movement, which you've got to start and follow through and shoot at the appropriate moment. You can practice and repeat the whole thing, but he alleges, I don't know because I don't fire a shotgun, that you can't break it down into little bits. So I've always been puzzled by how do people learn to pole vault? I mean, that does seem to me to be the ultimate thing that you've got to. Well, but people in this class beforehand have argued that you can to a certain extent anyway, but at some point you've got to commit to it, haven't you?
I think posture and all that type of thing is really important to give yourself the maximum potential. Because if you try and just tell someone to get over a high jump bar, for example, they'll probably stick with the original form, not the Crosby flop, and go over forward.
Yeah.
Or just try and do some kind of scissor kick, because they won't have any kind of idea that a Crosby flop's a good idea. Right. So to tell someone to jump over backwards and launch off one foot it's alien to them unless you give them a good example. And just a good example is enough to get the animation in someone's head and let them have a go. And same with firing a shotgun, but you can still practice the form of which position feet should be at the start. So the rifle, you've got one foot in front of the other. The shotgun, you've got your feet parallel. And that makes a big difference to performance on your shot.
Yes, yeah.
Isn't this where we risk being driven by assessment? In that you're teaching people how to shoot a clay pigeon, but not the actual understanding of what shooting actually is. I'll give you a classic example. In civil aviation that I'm just venturing into, they've got a whole raft of exams. Now, the difference to military aviation is military teaches you everything to do with principles of flight, for example. They don't just teach you how lift's generated, they teach you all the physics behind it, so you actually understand what's going on as well as aircraft has lift. Whereas in civil street, they tell you aircraft has lift, because the question in the exam is, how does an aircraft fly? Lift. That is all you need to know. You don't need to know the background to it, so they're being driven by the exam. Same with the shooting.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah.
so actually we're not teaching the knowledge, we're teaching the end result, which is wrong, because if you teach the knowledge, you can teach all the stances and things and what actually shooting is, and you should be able to get any weapon and shoot at a clay pigeon with that knowledge. But if you just simply teach how to use a shotgun against a clay pigeon without teaching the theory behind it, then you're forever bounded to that one thing.
Yeah.
And that's driven, that's you're being a slave to the assessment basically, and not the actual learning.
That's an interesting remark, because it comes up again in another area, which is in cooking. The standard way of going to catering college or FE college catering department, and the way in which you'll be taught to cook for some AQF level 3 course or something like that, is basically a series of recipes. And so I've been in umpteen times to observe people being taught that. Yeah, there are some skills, knife skills, all of those kinds of things, yes, but the bulk of the curriculum, once those have been established, is this is how to cook something basic, this is how to cook a stew, this is how to roast a chicken, this is all these kinds of things. If you go to the Cordon Bleu school in Paris, the curriculum is not recipes but techniques. Techniques which you can apply to umpteen different recipes. The recipe approach is ultimately self-limiting, because you're never going to make the breakthrough into creating your own dishes if you're hamstrung by having to stick to an established recipe, which is the canonical, approved way in which you do this thing. So all of the sort of celebrity chefs who make the breakthrough into doing things their own way can only do that on the basis that they've got a repertoire of techniques, and that they know if they assemble these techniques and, of course, these ingredients and flavours in a particular kind of way, then it'll work. Somebody who's tied down to the recipe doesn't have that. So again, it's the background knowledge, and it's the assessment which again drives that, because the assessment for your catering course is do a chicken Kiev from scratch, and that's fine as far as it goes. It doesn't go very far. So sorry, yes, right. So assessment methods. This is what's his name? Bowers' definition says influence on how and what students learn than any other single factor, of greater importance than the impact of teaching materials. Right. Any other points on that before we?
Just because that really links, doesn't it? That's the end result for the student, often. The assessment method would be the pass of their test or exam or their check or whatever it is. So therefore, that's why it influences.
Yes, precisely. And of course, again, this retention and achievement, particularly in relation to FE colleges, puts the pressure on. That's how they're going to be assessed. That's how you can tell that you're being successful. So just coach them to get through the exam, or produce something to the standard that